Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Oklahoma Territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1889, the Oklahoma Territory was a landscape in motion. Wagon trails cutting through red clay, towns rising overnight, and strangers claiming plots of prairie that had been no one's and everyone's all at once. According to early accounts documented later in territorial reports, this was an era of ambition and uncertainty when the boundaries of law were still soft and often blurred. Among the settlers who arrived that year was the Whitlock family: Samuel, his wife Margaret, and their two grown sons, Owen and Caleb. They purchased a patch of land a few miles west of Guthrie, building a small homestead surrounded by cottonwoods and a windmill that, by all recollections, never seemed to stop creaking. The family came from Missouri, though few could recall the exact town, and when asked, Samuel was known to say only, "We needed a place where the soil remembers no one." Neighbors described them as quiet but industrious. Margaret sold preserves in town every few weeks, her jars sealed neatly and labeled in tidy script. The sons handled most of the farm labor and occasional carpentry for nearby settlers. No one saw the family attend church, though their youngest, Caleb, once helped repair the steeple of St. Augustine's after a storm. The land around Guthrie, then, was still under the shifting jurisdiction of the newly forming Oklahoma Territory. A detail recorded in early territorial papers, later summarized in the Oklahoma Territory historical accounts. Lawmen were few, courts improvised, and disappearances, when noted at all, were treated as private misfortunes rather than public crimes. It was in this uncertain backdrop that the first whispers began, travelers vanishing between Guthrie and the Cimarron crossing. At first, no one connected these incidents to the Whitlocks. Roads were poorly mapped, storms could rise suddenly, and wolves were not yet gone from the prairie. But over time the pattern took shape. A trader from Topeka, a schoolteacher from Kansas City, two prospectors who had stopped for water. One night, in late autumn, a man named Elias Granger stumbled into Guthrie half delirious, claiming he'd seen lantern light near the Whitlock farm, heard shouting, and then silence. It was like the wind stopped to listen. He told the clerk of records, his words later copied into a worn affidavit preserved in county archives. Whether out of fear or disbelief, the report was filed but never acted upon. For months afterward, nothing more was said. Yet by the following spring, another set of travelers failed to reach town, and unease began to settle like dust over the prairie. By the summer of 1890, the Whitlock property had grown quiet, in a way that locals later called unnatural. The steady clank of their windmill could still be heard across the fields, but few ever saw movement near the house itself. Travelers who passed on horseback spoke of smoke rising from the chimney long after sundown, and some claimed to hear the rhythmic pounding of tools, perhaps from the sons, repairing something underground. At the time, Guthrie was swelling with new arrivals after the first land runs, as described in early chronicles of the Oklahoma Territory. Those records mention a surge of strangers, homesteaders, drifters, and opportunists, each chasing their own claim. In such chaos, a missing man or two rarely stirred alarm. Still, several families in town quietly noted that people who stopped at the Whitlocks' farm for water or directions often failed to arrive at their next destination. One witness, a mail carrier named Dorian Pike, later testified that he had delivered a package to the farm in July and noticed a sharp, sour smell near the root cellar. He described Samuel Whitlock as polite, but distant, his speech deliberate, almost rehearsed. Margaret remained inside, visible only through a cracked curtain. Pike said he recalled seeing 3 pairs of boots lined neatly outside the door, too many for a household of 4. When Marshal Everett Lawson, newly appointed under the territorial government, reviewed Pike's account months later, he noted that it coincided with other fragments in the town's complaint ledger, an unusual consistency in a time when gossip often blurred with truth. Lawson marked it worthy of discreet inquiry. But the Whitlocks' property lay beyond his official jurisdiction, and no formal investigation followed. By autumn, rumors thickened like the prairie fog. A prospector named Harlan Finch was last seen heading west toward Guthrie Creek. His horse was later found grazing near a stand of elms, saddle still intact, rider gone. Another man, a trader from Fort Smith, was discovered days later, buried shallowly beneath loose soil near a dry streambed. The coroner, Dr. Amos Brinley, described the condition of the body as consistent with hurried interment and deliberate concealment. At a tavern one evening, when asked what he thought, Dr. Brinley was said to have murmured, "Whoever buried him had practice." Folks began locking their doors earlier. Some whispered that the Whitlocks' windmill no longer drew water but dug secrets from the earth. A traveler passing through claimed that he'd seen a woman digging behind the barn at dusk, her skirts heavy with soil. Whether this tale was true or simply frontier invention remains unknown. A small notice appeared in the Guthrie Herald that November. Persons traveling the western road advised to do so by daylight. Strange disturbances reported near Whitlock Crossing. No arrests followed, no inquiries were made. The law, thin as it was, had other priorities. By the turn of the year, the Whitlocks' isolation deepened further. Their sons no longer came into town, and their crops went unharvested, though the smoke from their chimney never ceased. When the snows came early in 1891, several neighbors said the fields seemed untouched, as though even the frost avoided settling there. When the thaw came in early 1891, the creeks rose, revealing what the frost had hidden. Near a bend in Guthrie Creek, a boy found a fragment of cloth tangled around a tree root, blue serge, the sort worn by traveling salesmen. Beneath it, a strip of leather stamped with the initials H.F. was discovered. The sheriff's office noted it as belonging to Harlan Finch, the missing prospector, though no one could explain how his remains had ended up miles from where his horse was found. The news stirred little official action. As later chronicled in accounts of the Oklahoma Territory, law enforcement then was a loose weave of deputies, volunteer marshals, and wandering judges. Paperwork often lagged behind reality. Still, the discovery unsettled the locals enough that a small search party, a blacksmith, 2 ranchers, and a parson, rode out toward the Whitlock place, claiming they meant only to inquire after the family's welfare. What they found was not immediate evidence of crime, but rather the feeling that something had already gone terribly wrong. The house stood sound yet strangely empty, as though its owners had stepped out moments before and never returned. The table was set for 4, cups overturned, bread left to harden. Dust had gathered thick across the window ledges, but the floorboards were recently scrubbed, the scent of lye still strong. Behind the barn, they found fresh earth, a long, uneven mound where the grass had not yet grown back. The parson, a man named Reverend Alcott, urged caution. "We have no proof," he said. "Let the marshal see to it." But the blacksmith, whose brother-in-law had vanished on that road the previous fall, struck his spade into the soil before the others could stop him. They dug until sundown. What they unearthed was shallow, hurried, and grim. Beneath the packed dirt lay 2 bodies, one male, one female, both with broken wrists and rope burns across the neck. Neither was a Whitlock. Marshal Lawson arrived 2 days later. He sealed the site and ordered statements from each man present. In his notes, fragments of which survive in the territorial archives, he wrote, "Scene consistent with intentional concealment. No sign of forced entry or struggle at residence. Property appears abandoned." Margaret Whitlock's jars of preserves were still lined along the cellar wall, each labeled and sealed, though several were found filled not with fruit but coarse gray sand. Owen and Caleb's tools lay neatly arranged, wiped clean of rust. In the following weeks, search efforts widened. Teams combed the prairie, following faint trails toward the Cimarron. They found little, only footprints leading from the well to the back field, where the soil sank unevenly underfoot. By midsummer, townsfolk began calling it the Farm of the Unreturning. Travelers detoured miles out of their way to avoid the road. And yet, the Whitlocks themselves remained unseen, neither captured nor confirmed dead. That autumn, Marshal Lawson sent a report east to Fort Smith, urging further assistance, citing the Whitlock matter as evidence of the territory's need for federal oversight. The request was noted but delayed. Other regions demanded attention. And so the land fell silent again, with only the windmill turning, slow, steady, relentless, against the vast Oklahoma sky. By the first chill of 1892, the Whitlock farm had already entered local legend. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones at taverns, describing lights moving through the fields at night, and a faint smell of smoke that never seemed to fade. In Guthrie, children dared one another to ride past the property after dark, though few made it farther than the first fence post before turning back. The county clerk, Mr. Silas Dorr, included mention of the Whitlock tract in a boundary revision report that year, one of the few official documents still referencing the family. He described the land as presently unclaimed, containing structures of value but standing under superstition. Dorr's language, careful as it was, reflected the uneasy balance between record-keeping and rumor that defined much of early administration in the Oklahoma Territory. When Marshal Lawson revisited the site that spring, he was accompanied by a newspaperman from Kansas named Amos Drury. Drury had come west to document the growing settlements and, perhaps, to chase a story that could sell papers back east. In his notebook, later found among his estate, Drury described the house as a structure built by competent hands, though weathered by years, and strangely absent of birdsong. He noted the floorboards of the main room had been pried up in places, as if someone had searched beneath them. In the barn, he found a ledger belonging to Owen Whitlock, its pages filled with neat arithmetic and the names of travelers, dates, initials, and brief notations such as lodged one night, owed $2, or simply gone. Lawson filed this evidence with the territorial court, though the ledger was never entered into public record. No criminal confirmed, the margin reads in faint graphite, but implication heavy. When the men examined the property's well, they found it sealed with stones and pitch. Lawson hesitated to open it, remarking that such work required both authority and willpower he did not possess. But Drury, ever eager, pried away one stone with his boot. What rose from the gap was not water, but air, heavy with decay. They left the well untouched after that, recording only its coordinates and sealing it again with timber. Lawson's report, later summarized in a footnote to Oklahoma Territory histories, listed the site as uninhabited, unsafe, likely contaminated. In the months that followed, Drury published 2 serialized articles under the title The Vanished Homestead. His prose was cautious yet haunting. Some homes guard their dead, and others, it seems, refuse to release them. The stories drew attention briefly, then faded as new land runs and political disputes filled the headlines. Back in Guthrie, the memory of the Whitlocks began to thin, turning from fact to folklore. Some said the family had fled south into Texas. Others claimed they were buried beneath their own cellar. A few whispered that Margaret had been seen walking near the creek at dusk, carrying a lantern whose flame never dimmed. Whether these tales held truth or simply soothed the unease of those who remained, no one could say. What persisted was the silence, that peculiar hush that still seemed to hang over the land where the windmill once turned. In early 1893, a new family by the name of Wren petitioned the county to purchase the Whitlock property. They had come from Arkansas, newly married, and eager to start fresh on the open plains. The clerk hesitated, but could find no legal reason to refuse the sale. The land was technically unclaimed. The Whitlocks had left no heirs, no wills, no trace in the surviving county ledgers. The Wrens moved in by March. At first all seemed normal. The soil was rich, the well, once drained and refitted, produced clear water. Their letters to relatives back east spoke of promise and sunlight, of a small orchard they intended to plant. But by June, the tone changed. "Night brings a sound in the fields," wrote Martha Wren to her sister. "It's not wind. though it moves like breath. The dog will not go beyond the porch. In July, their farmhand, a young creek man named Jonah, refused to stay overnight. He told neighbors that when he fetched water after sundown, he could see shapes moving just beneath the surface of the well, as if the reflections remembered something. Within weeks, Jonah vanished altogether. His belongings were later found stacked neatly beside the barn. Marshall Lawson, his hair now streaked with gray, and his patience with the territory wearing thin, returned once more to the property. By this time, the Oklahoma Territory Administration had begun to formalize its law enforcement structure, and his jurisdiction finally extended to Guthrie's outskirts. He arrived accompanied by Deputy Marin Hodge and Reverend Alcott, who had witnessed the earlier exhumations. The Wrens were reluctant to speak, but the fear in their eyes told more than their words. Lawson spent a night in the farmhouse himself, recording his impressions in a private journal. That entry, later retrieved from his effects, read simply, "No peace in this place. The floorboards groan, though no one walk. Center, there is moisture where there should be none. The air feels watched." At dawn, Lawson investigated the root cellar. The jars still lined the shelves, their contents spoiled and swollen. A thin trail of moisture led to a back wall where the brick appeared newer than the rest. When he tapped it with his cane, it rang hollow. They broke through by lantern light, revealing a small cavity, a space just wide enough for a man to crouch. Inside lay a rusted shovel, 3 folded blankets, and a child's shoe. Reverend Alcott crossed himself. "They buried more than sin here," he whispered. The cavity's dirt floor was disturbed, but no longer yielded remains. Perhaps the ground had shifted, or perhaps someone had come long after and removed what was hidden there. Lawson's report of that visit, the last he ever filed before leaving the service, ends with a single line: "The Whitlock farm is best left to itself." Soon after, the Wrens abandoned the property. Within months, fire consumed what remained of the farmhouse. The origin was never determined. By 1894, the land was once again listed as unfit for habitation. On maps of the Oklahoma Territory, printed years later, a faint annotation appeared beside its coordinates, simply the word deserted. For several years after the Wrens fled, the Whitlock property lay untouched, its charred beams standing like ribs against the prairie sky. Locals began to use it as a marker when giving directions. Ride past the old Whitlock place, then turn east toward Guthrie Creek. Even so, few willingly passed by after dark. In 1895, a traveling surveyor named Edwin Clymer recorded the ruins while charting new boundaries for territorial expansion. His notes, later referenced in regional studies of the Oklahoma Territory, described the remains as a homestead of sound initial construction, subsequently destroyed by uncontrolled fire, ground disturbed in several quadrants, cause uncertain. Clymer stayed only one night near the site, camping a few hundred yards away. His journal entry from that evening was brief but peculiar. "Windmill turning through no wind. Heard faint metallic tapping from beneath the soil near the well. Left before dawn." Such entries might have been dismissed as nerves or frontier superstition, yet others who camped nearby wrote similar observations. Cowboys driving cattle along the Cimarron Trail said their horses balked near the ruins, ears twitching as if hearing a pitch of sound no human could catch. By 1896, the site had become a point of whispered fascination for settlers and drifters alike. 2 young men from Guthrie, Tom Evers and Clyde Paris, boasted that they would spend an entire night there to prove ghosts can't plow dirt. They carried a lantern, a flask, and a pocket Bible borrowed from the Methodist mission. Only Clyde returned. When questioned, he claimed that around midnight the lantern flame folded in on itself, and the air grew so cold that his breath turned white. He heard the rhythmic creak of the windmill, and then what he thought were voices murmuring beneath the ground. Terrified, he ran until he reached the main road, not realizing until morning that Tom Evers was no longer behind him. A search party later found Tom's coat near the remains of the barn. No body was recovered. Tracks led toward the creek and then vanished in the mud. Sheriff's deputies searched the banks for days before declaring him drowned. The report concluded, death by misadventure, probable. Years later, locals would still recall that the name Evers was one of the last added to the Guthrie Register before the town stopped keeping record of disappearances altogether. By the decade's end, new settlers had arrived in the territory, and the federal government's push to organize counties and rail lines began to overshadow the older stories. Yet, like the dust that clung to the prairie grass, the Whitlock legend refused to disappear. Older residents swore that on still nights one could hear the faint groan of that windmill, even though it had long since fallen. And though newer maps no longer labeled the property, riders said they always knew when they were near, because the air grew still and the horses stopped of their own accord. By 1897, the Whitlock farm had become a cautionary landmark for surveyors and settlers alike, a stretch of land known not for its yield, but for its silence. The Oklahoma Territory newspapers by then were busy with stories of statehood and the rush of railroads, yet once every few months the name Whitlock would appear in a column or side note, usually tied to another disappearance or unfortunate incident near the western prairie tracts. One such report came that spring from a freight driver named Jonah Kells, who was said to have camped near the site while hauling goods between Guthrie and Kingfisher. His written statement, preserved in a county file now yellowed with age, told of a strange figure seen walking at dawn near the ruins. Kells described it as a woman, or what looked like one, wearing a bonnet, though her face shone like pale glass in the morning light. When he called out, the figure vanished behind a burnt beam. Most dismissed his tale as exhaustion or drink, but those who had lived in the territory since before its formal organization remembered the stories of Margaret Whitlock and her sons. "They've come back to finish what they started," one old farmer said, shaking his head. "Some debts can't be buried deep enough." Around the same time, a group of university men from Kansas traveled south to collect soil and mineral samples for an agricultural study. One of them, Professor Henry Latham, later published a small pamphlet describing his findings. Though the document focused on geology, a curious footnote stood out. At a site once recorded as the Whitlock property near Guthrie Creek, subsurface samples contained high traces of lime and ash not typical to this region. The ground appears repeatedly disturbed and refilled. Whether Latham knew the history of the farm remains uncertain, but his observation reignited local speculation. If the Ertin itself bore scars of repeated burial, perhaps there had been more than 2 victims, more than the shallow graves uncovered years before. In late autumn of that same year, a fire swept through a portion of the prairie, scorching a path dangerously close to the ruins. When residents rode out to assess the damage, they found that the fire had oddly spared the area surrounding the old well. The grass around it stood unburned, and faint impressions, like footsteps, led away into the charred field, fading into nothing. Marshall Lawson, long retired, received a letter about the event, but never returned to investigate. His declining health kept him in Guthrie, where he reportedly told a younger officer, "If that land still stands, it'll keep its secrets. Don't go digging where the earth has already answered." By winter's end, settlers began building further west, and the Whitlock site faded again into the margins of memory. Yet, the few who traveled that road after nightfall claimed to see faint light flickering from the ground, as though something beneath the soil still breathed. In the following years, official references to the farm ceased altogether, but in taverns and depot houses, the legend endured, spoken softly, half believed, but never forgotten. As the century neared its close, Oklahoma Territory was changing faster than memory could keep pace. Rail lines cut across what had once been silent prairies, towns took root, and the voices of progress drowned out the older stories whispered by firelight. Yet even in that age of ambition, some corners of the land refused to forget. The Whitlock property remained one such corner, a scar that settlers quietly circled on their maps but never discussed aloud. In 1898, the Territory's Agricultural Office commissioned a new survey of unused farmland to encourage settlement. Among the listed tracts was the Whitlock parcel, now described simply as Lot 14, Section 22, available for claim. The listing was factual, bureaucratic, and entirely devoid of warning. When the name crossed the desk of a clerk named Marion Halper, she hesitated, recognizing it from older records. Her logbook contains a brief annotation. Recommend caution, past irregularities in ownership. But paperwork moved faster than memory, and the listing went through. The land was soon claimed by a bachelor farmer named Elias Booker, a Civil War veteran who believed little in spirits and less in gossip. Neighbors described him as pragmatic and calm, a man who slept soundly and spoke rarely. He built a small cabin on the northern edge of the property, careful not to disturb the old foundation where the Whitlock home had once stood. For the first few months, Booker's letters to a friend in Kansas were mundane, accounts of weather, planting, and the stubbornness of prairie grass. But one letter from November 1898, preserved by that friend's descendants, revealed a subtle unease. There is a draft that comes from the ground at night. Not from cracks in the cabin, mind you, but from below. Sometimes I hear what sounds like a shovel, though I am alone. The dog growls at the well and will not drink from it. By Jan. January, Booker's correspondence ceased altogether. When spring arrived and no one had seen him in town, a supply merchant rode out to check. He found the cabin door ajar, the hearth cold, and a single chair overturned. The bed was neatly made, the boots by the door aligned. Booker's horse stood tethered and half-starved, the feet untouched. The merchant reported the matter to local lawmen, but by then the office was overwhelmed with disputes over land rights and railroad contracts. A single missing farmer warranted little notice. His disappearance was added to the registry, one more name beneath the line, presumed missing. Weeks later, a settler passing near Guthrie Creek discovered a small mound of earth topped with a single stone. The initials E.B. were carved into it, shallow and crude, as if by a dull knife. No one ever confirmed whether the grave was real or merely a cruel jest carved by some wanderer. When officials from the territorial office reviewed the case later that year, they cited it as another unfortunate reminder of the risks of isolated farming. Yet in private, one clerk noted in the margin, another name for the ground that will not keep still. By the dawn of 1899, few dared speak of the Whitlock farm aloud, but the silence that hung over it, the same stillness first noted in the early reports of the Oklahoma Territory, was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of something waiting. The spring of 1899 brought storms to the Oklahoma Territory, long rolling thunder that cracked over the plains and carved new gullies in the red earth. Farmers welcomed the rain, but those who lived near Guthrie Creek said it unearthed more than crops that year. After one particularly violent night, a boy found fragments of bone along the creek's edge, half buried in the mud. At first, he thought them animal remains, until his father noticed the clean shape of a jaw. The sheriff at Guthrie dispatched a small team to investigate, though records of the inquiry are scarce. An entry in the Territorial Incident Log, dated May 17, 1899, notes only: human remains located west of Guthrie Creek, approximate to abandoned Whitlock property, cause indeterminate. No further follow-up is recorded, yet in nearby taverns, talk flared again. Old-timers who still remembered the first exhumations claimed the rains had disturbed what the earth had been bribed to keep. One farmer, Ephraim Cutter, told the weekly Guthrie Standard that he'd seen light leaking from the ground itself near the old windmill base. When asked to explain, he said, "It's as if the soil sighs." Around this time, an itinerant photographer named Charles Dyer passed through the area, offering portraits to settlers for a few cents each. Dyer, intrigued by the locals' nervous tone, decided to visit the ruins to capture what he called a relic of the untamed frontier. He developed his plates in a small tent near the creek, and in his surviving letters, now held in a university archive, he described the results as distorted, each exposure fogged around the edges, though my lens was clear. In one frame, he wrote, the outline of the windmill appears, though I never set my camera in that direction. The shape seems to shimmer faintly, like breath on glass. He never attempted another photograph of the site. By a pair. Utum. Another small blaze swept through the dry grasslands, this time scorching the perimeter of the old Whitlock property. When the fire reached the collapsed well, witnesses claimed it flared unnaturally high and then extinguished itself, leaving the soil blackened but cold to the touch. The phenomenon drew a brief mention in a territorial newsletter, which noted it as spontaneous combustion of residual gas, though no such gases were known to occur in that area. Marshall Lawson, frail and near the end of his life, read the article from his bed in Guthrie. According to his nurse's recollection, he muttered something about the ledger left unfinished before falling silent for the last time. When his belongings were later inventoried, his old notebook was found among them, its final page carrying only 3 words: still turning wind. At the close of the century, the Whitlock farm remained abandoned. Cartographers began omitting it from newer maps, calling the land unsurveyable. Yet, passing settlers still marked the place in their own way, with a small detour, a whispered warning, or a prayer murmured under breath as they rode by. And when the wind rose at night across that lonely stretch of prairie, those who listened swore it carried a hollow rhythm, steady, uneven, and metallic, as though somewhere out there, beneath the stars, the old Whitlock windmill still turned. The first years of the new century brought with them a fragile sense of order to the Oklahoma Territory. Towns grew, telegraph lines cut across the plains, and the law, once as thin as smoke, began to take a firmer shape. Yet some places, like the land west of Guthrie Creek, resisted change, as if bound by a quieter, older covenant. The Whitlock farm, though burned, buried, and officially erased, refused to stay forgotten. In 1901, a small survey expedition sent from Fort Reno stumbled upon the area while charting floodplains. Their leader, Lieutenant Adrian Ward, kept a precise log of his movements, a habit learned from years of military discipline. Ward's entry for July 3rd reads, "Ruins of a farmhouse observed, coordinates unlisted in prior charts, remnants of windmill foundation intact, ground unusually soft though rainfall has been sparse, men uneasy, they speak of voices underfoot when driving stakes." A corporal accompanying the survey later confirmed that the men heard something faint but rhythmic, as if someone were knocking from below. Ward dismissed it publicly, but privately confessed his discomfort in a letter home, writing, "The soil hums at night. No wind, yet the grass moves." The lieutenant's superiors filed his report without comment, but one of his assistants, a young draftsman named Harlan Day, kept a copy of the field map. Years later, when interviewed for a local history project, Day claimed that when he traced the soil depressions near the ruins, the outline resembled a series of narrow trenches, roughly human length. He was careful to add, "It could be coincidence, the land shifts often." Still, his words carried weight among the older settlers who remembered what had been found there a decade before. Around this same period, the Oklahoma Territory papers began circulating a short column titled "Vanished Homesteads, a Serialized Feat." You're describing lost or abandoned properties of historical curiosity. One such entry, printed in the Guthrie Gazette in August 1902, mentioned a burned residence west of the creek where rumor insists the dead still turn in the earth. The article's tone was skeptical, yet tinged with fascination. "It is said," the writer noted, "that the wind there does not behave as wind ought. It circles without direction, as though chasing something that cannot leave." By 1903, the area was once again marked for development, this time as part of a ranching initiative financed by a merchant cooperative in Texas. Representatives rode north to inspect the land and reported no issue beyond soil instability and unease among hired hands. The deal fell through within a month. One of the men later confessed that the workers refused to stake the property after hearing sounds from the old well, a low, pulsing thud like someone knocking from deep water. The official reason recorded in territorial archives: unfit for agriculture due to drainage complications. Yet in private letters the story was different. One overseer wrote to his employer in Dallas, "You cannot pay a man enough to plow a graveyard." Through those years, the Whitlock story passed from rumor into folklore. Children of settlers grew up hearing fragments from grandparents about the silent family, the windmill that turned by itself, the cellar that whispered at night. Some said the Whitlocks were punished by their own victims. Others swore they had simply vanished into the soil they once tilled. And still, the prairie kept its secret rhythm, that faint mechanical groan, the sound of something buried yet unbroken, turning ceaselessly beneath the Oklahoma sky. In 1904, a young historian named Ruth Mather arrived in Guthrie to compile oral accounts for what she called A Frontier of Shadows, a collection intended to document the lesser-known human stories of the Oklahoma Territory before statehood. Mather had studied under Professor Henry Latham, whose soil analysis years earlier had quietly drawn attention to the disturbed ground around the Whitlock farm. Her methods were methodical, her tone cautious. She sought fact, not fable. She began by interviewing aging settlers who had lived near Guthrie Creek during the 1880s and 1890s. Her notes, preserved today in regional archives, are filled with half-finished sentences and fading ink, but one entry stands out. All of them remember the windmill. They speak of it as if it had a mind of its own, turning when there was no wind, creaking at times when the night was still. Even those who never saw it swear they heard it. Mather visited the site herself in August 1904, accompanied by a local guide named Benjamin Holt. Her diary recounts their journey in sparse factual prose, ground uneven, littered with iron fragments, well covered with timber, found remnants of brick near cellar site, air unusually cool, horse refused to cross the boundary fence, no birds observed. She described a faint vibration underfoot, a sensation she first attributed to fatigue from travel but later could not explain. It was as though the earth was breathing, she wrote. Holt, more superstitious, refused to stay after sundown. That night, Mather lodged in Guthrie and transcribed her field notes. The next morning, when she returned to review her sketches, she found that her map had smeared. The ink around the marked location had spread outward like spilled water. Her annotation beside it reads only, "Not an error of pen, I am certain." When Mather presented her preliminary report to the Oriole Historical Society later that year, she included references to both the Oklahoma Territory Administrative Formation and the early Whitlock reports. Her tone remained academic, but uneasy. "There are places," she wrote, "where the law of settlement has not erased the law of the land. The Whitlock property stands as testament that not all ground may be possessed." Her work never reached publication. The manuscript, filed under Frontier Case Studies, was later lost in a courthouse fire in 1907, along with several county ledgers from the same era, an event later recorded as accidental ignition by faulty wiring, though electric lines had not yet reached that district. In Guthrie, townsfolk recalled seeing Mather leave by train soon after, pale and withdrawn. She never returned to the territory. Over the following years, the land west of Guthrie Creek remained marked only by silence. No more surveyors came, and new settlers avoided it entirely. When asked why, one elderly rancher offered the simplest of answers. The ground there remembers things too well. And so, while statehood dawned and Oklahoma began to rise from its frontier past, one small patch of prairie refused to move forward. The Whitlock farm stayed still, as if time itself paused at its boundary, unwilling to disturb the soil that had already spoken. By 1906, Guthrie had grown into a thriving town, boasting hotels, a telegraph office, and talk of soon becoming the capital of the new state to be. The old stories of murders, vanishings, and the Whitlock farm began to sound quaint beside the crackle of electric light and the rumble of freight trains. Yet, as with any growing city, shadows collected just beyond the lamplight. The Oklahoma Territory records from that period mention an increasing number of trespassing reports west of the creek, where youths from town dared each other to visit the ruins after dusk. Most came back shaken, laughing nervously, their courage spent. But one incident that autumn stood apart. 3 boys, Amos Reed, Peter Lyle, and Jacob Hollis, went out with lanterns, determined to bring back a relic from what they called the ghost farm. They planned to retrieve one of the iron bolts from the windmill foundation, proof for their schoolmates that they had stood upon cursed ground. They returned at dawn, two of them silent, one bleeding from a gash across his palm. Amos, the oldest, would not speak for days. When he finally did, he told his father they had heard breathing from the well. He claimed the air grew warm and thick, and something metallic rang below, like a chain drawn through water. Peter, trembling, confirmed part of the story, saying the sound grew louder the closer they stepped to the well, as though it knew we were there. Only Jacob refused to comment. He left Guthrie within a week and never came back. The sheriff, weary of the recurring talk, rode out to investigate. He found nothing but the remnants of the old foundation and a scattering of ash where fire had once scorched the earth. Still, his horse balked at the fence line and refused to cross. "Animals remember," he told the clerk later, "even when men choose to forget." In December of that same year, the snow covered the region. For the first time in years, travelers said they could see faint outlines under the frost. Impressions of rectangular shapes, aligned neatly in a row. By morning, the snow had drifted over them, and the ground returned to silence. A schoolteacher named Clara Deems, who boarded near the Western Road, mentioned the sighting in a letter to her cousin. "It looked for all the world like graves, dear Sarah, long and narrow, the snow catching on their edges as if outlining what lay beneath. The strangest thing, though, was the warmth of the air above them. Even in that cold, the snow there melted first." Her letter was printed decades later in a small collection of territorial correspondences, adding a final trace of credibility to the fading legend. By the time Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the land that had once been the Whitlock Farm was marked simply as private property, owner unknown. The new records made no mention of the family, the disappearances, or the abandoned well. But locals said that on still nights, particularly in winter, when the air was dry and the moon low, the faint clank of a turning blade could be heard drifting over the frozen grass. They said it turned slow, steady, as if keeping time with something deep below the earth. And those who knew the story best avoided the sound entirely, for they believed the windmill was not moved by wind, but by the restless hands of those who had never truly left. By 1908, statehood had been declared, and Oklahoma was entering a new chapter, one of modern towns, paved streets, and a growing belief that the frontier was finally tamed. Yet among the older settlers, those who remembered when law was just a man with a badge and a lantern, the story of the Whitlocks still lingered. It was no longer told as a warning, but as a reminder that some places, no matter how modern the world becomes, refuse to be rewritten. A small article appeared in the Oklahoma State Register that spring, under the modest headline, "Curious Sight Near Guthrie Creek." It described the rediscovery of an overgrown well, likely from a pre-statehood farm, and noted that a new rancher had plans to fill it in and reclaim the surrounding pasture. The reporter, unaware of the land's infamy, remarked how odd it is that this section, so close to town, has remained unused all these years. The rancher, a widower named Paul Hensley, hired 2 men to help with the clearing. Their work was efficient but uneasy. One of the laborers later told the county registrar that the soil near the old cellar sank under our boots like damp sponge, though there'd been no rain for weeks. When they began to shovel the loose earth near the well, they struck something hollow. At first, they assumed it was the remnant of a support beam, but when they dug further, they uncovered what appeared to be a row of wooden boxes, the kind used for grain or storage. The air grew so foul that Hensley ordered them to stop until morning. They covered the site and rode into town for supplies. When they returned the next day, the hole was empty. The boxes were gone, the soil smooth as though it had never been disturbed. Only their own shovel marks remained. Hensley insisted they'd simply misjudged the site. His men disagreed, one quitting immediately, the other refusing to work past sundown. The remaining laborer, a man named Wexler, told a blacksmith later that he'd heard the creak of a wheel in the night, like an old mill turning slow. even though there wasn't wind enough to stir a flag. The state register printed a follow-up a week later, though by then the rancher had already abandoned his claim, citing family illness. In truth, Hensley sold his livestock and left Guthrie altogether. His last recorded statement to a neighbor was simple: "Some ground wants to stay closed." Years later, the local historical society attempted to catalog the early farms of Logan County. The Whitlock homestead was the only tract with no surviving deed, no surviving owner, and no clear boundary. It existed only as a space between lines, a gap on the map. Professor Latham, long retired but still active in correspondence, referenced it once more in his 1909 lecture at the University of Kansas, using it as a case study in how the folklore of the Oklahoma Territory reveals the intersection between land and human fear. His words, though clinical, carried a strange respect for the tale. Some histories are written on paper, others are written in the soil, and those are the ones we cannot erase. By then, the Whitlocks had become ghosts, not only in legend, but in the paperwork of the new state itself. Their names were gone from all official record. Only the windmill, it was said, still turned when the prairie was still, whispering the old rhythm of a farm that had once harvested more than crops. By 1910, the region west of Guthrie Creek had been almost entirely reclaimed by prairie grass. The new state of Oklahoma was bustling with oil speculation, schools, and the chatter of progress, and no one had time for ghost stories from the territorial past. Yet, history has a way of keeping its own ledger, and in that year, the Whitlock name surfaced once more, quietly, through the most mundane of means, a tax dispute. A clerk in the Guthrie courthouse named Franklin Knoll was assigned to reconcile unclaimed parcels from the old Oklahoma Territory files. Among them was an entry labeled Whitlock Samuel, Lot 14, Section 22. Knoll, diligent to a fault, attempted to trace the owner's lineage. When his search turned up no heirs, he sent an inquiry to the county survey office. Days later, the request returned with a note scrawled across the top: "Do not reassess. Ground listed as inactive property since 1894. Puzzled, Knoll visited the tract himself. His field report, dated April 17, 1910, survives in the county archives. Visited old boundary of Section 22. No visible habitation. Ground unusually soft in central portion. Felt tremor beneath surface. Possible groundwater shift. Unclear origin. Suggests site excluded from reassessment." That evening, Knoll dined at the boarding house on Noble Avenue, telling fellow clerks about the strange vibration he'd felt. One laughed and told him he'd simply walked too near the Whitlock Hole, a name the older men still used with quiet jest. Knoll, unnerved, pressed for more detail. The eldest among them, a former surveyor, said simply, "If you stood there long enough, you'd feel the ground breathing back." 3 days later, Knoll failed to report to work. His landlady found his bed untouched, his boots by the door, and his journal on the table. The final entry read, "Heard the creek again. It's slower now, like it's tired." Searchers combed the surrounding prairie for days, but found no sign of him. Only his measuring rod lay in the grass near the old well. The story reached the Guthrie Gazette, which treated it with mild skepticism, filing it under local oddities. But in the courthouse, older clerks stopped laughing. That summer, a group of construction workers laying telegraph poles near the creek reported that their equipment malfunctioned within the same radius. Compasses spun, and the ground seemed to hum like a struck string. An engineer blamed magnetic deposits. Others, quietly, thought of the stories they'd heard in childhood. The state eventually reclassified the area as unfit for infrastructure, a polite bureaucratic phrase that effectively sealed it from development. It became a void on every official map, not forbidden, not owned, just absent. In later recollections, townsfolk said the land looked ordinary from a distance: golden grass, a line of cottonwoods, a shallow dip where the farmhouse once stood. But those who approached too closely described an unease that settled in the chest, a pressure behind the eyes, and a faint echo in the ears, like the turning of something vast and unseen below. By the close of that decade, few spoke the Whitlock name aloud. Yet, in whispered conversations, it still lived, not as accusation or myth, but as a quiet understanding. Some lands keep what they're given. And every now and then, when storms rolled over the plains and lightning split the sky, farmers swore they could see it. The silhouette of a windmill, rising where no structure stood, spinning slow and defiant against the thunder. In the spring of 1911, a group of engineering students from Oklahoma A&M College traveled through the Guthrie district to conduct fieldwork for a soil drainage study. Their instructor, Professor J.J. Winder, was an energetic man with little patience for superstition. When his assistant mentioned that one of their assigned sectors overlapped the old Whitlock tract, Winder reportedly replied, "A farmer's ghost won't trouble science." They reached the site on April 9th. Photographs taken that day show the students smiling beside their instruments, the prairie around them perfectly ordinary. No ruins, no markers, only grass. Yet, in their logbook, the entry for that section departs from routine observation. Surface vibration noted during core sampling. Sound registered on phonograph as faint mechanical rhythm, unidentified. Instruments undamaged. Group unease significant. Later analysis at the college laboratory found no geological explanation for the recording, though it reportedly captured a subtle metallic groan that repeated at intervals, like a wheel under strain. When the students played it back for townsfolk, several older residents recognized the cadence instantly. One whispered, "That's the Whitlock windmill." The college confiscated the cylinder, citing instrumental contamination. It was never returned. The Oklahoma Territory reference appeared once more that year in a paper by Professor Winder himself. He wrote cautiously of the challenges of surveying pre-statehood tracts and the strange persistence of localized disturbances that resisted classification. While he did not name the Whitlock site, his footnotes included a curious phrase, "Example found west of Guthrie, a place where the land seems to remember itself." In Guthrie, meanwhile, the story reawakened. Farmers once again began avoiding the western road. One wagoner swore that at night he saw faint lights moving along the old boundary fence, like lanterns bobbing in the field. When he rode closer, the lights vanished, leaving only the steady moan of wind across the grass, or what he hoped was wind. Around that time, an aging Reverend Alcott, the same man who had once stood over the Whitlock cellar decades earlier, wrote a final letter to his nephew. The paper, later found among family effects, contained trembling words. "I have prayed for those souls, but the ground there has no forgiveness left in it. When you hear the turning, and you will if you listen, do not mistake it for the wind. It is the sound of unfinished penance." By winter, a few curious travelers still ventured near, often journalists chasing the story of Oklahoma's most haunted land. One, a correspondent named Lydia Rowe, described visiting the site on a bright December afternoon. "There is nothing to see, and yet it feels as though the prairie watches. My boots sank deeper than they should have. I heard a faint chime, or perhaps my imagination. But when I looked up, the grass was moving in circles, though the air was still." Her article, printed in the Evening Herald of 1912, closed with a line that would later become part of the region's folklore. "If the Whitlocks ever left this world, they left their breath behind." By then, nearly a quarter of a century had passed since the family vanished, yet their story remained lodged in the soil, as enduring as the red dust itself, unwilling to yield to memory or time. By 1913, Guthrie had settled into the rhythm of modern life. The railway's whistle now echoed where once the windmill had turned, and the territory's rough edges were smoothing into the habits of a young state. Yet the land west of the creek, that unclaimed section where the Whitlock home once stood, remained conspicuously vacant. Surveyors passed it over, settlers ignored it, and maps continued to leave a pale, blank patch where roads should have crossed. In that same year, a visiting scholar from Chicago, Dr. Eli Forster, arrived to document frontier folklore. He interviewed local residents, miners, and descendants of early settlers, seeking to separate myth from history. His notes reveal a blend of curiosity and unease. "No single legend in this region endures with such precision," Forster wrote. "Even those who claim disbelief can recount the names, dates, and manner of vanishing. It is less a story than a contagion of memory." Forster visited the site on a mild April afternoon. He described it as unremarkable at first glance: tall grass, half-buried stones, the faint contour of a foundation. Yet he lingered long enough to hear what countless others had claimed before: the low, uneven groan beneath the earth. In his report, he compared it to a submerged bell tolling through soil. Later that evening, Forster dined at a Guthrie hotel and shared his findings with a retired marshal who had served under Lawson decades prior. The old man, coughing from years of dust and tobacco, listened without surprise. "You went out there," he said quietly. "Then you felt it." That's what he called the breathing ground. The phrase struck Forster deeply. In his published article later that year, Folklore of the Early Oklahoma Territory, he referenced the case indirectly, but with striking accuracy. "There exists, west of Guthrie, a site that exemplifies the psychology, weight of unatoned violence upon frontier settlement. The locals believe the land itself remembers the wrong. I will not name the place, but those who know it call it cursed." The piece circulated briefly in academic circles, but few outside Oklahoma paid it much mind. Within the territory, however, it rekindled interest among the curious and the reckless. A few young men from the college attempted to locate the well again, using Forster's vague coordinates. They returned empty-handed, but they swore that during their search they heard the steady clank of metal on metal, fading in and out like breath. That summer, strange weather plagued the county. Whirlwinds struck without warning, flattening fences near Guthrie Creek, but leaving the surrounding farms untouched. One twister passed directly over the suspected Whitlock plot. Witnesses said it spun in place longer than any storm they'd seen, kicking up red dust that glittered faintly in the sun, as if mixed with flecks of metal. A preacher from Crescent interpreted the event in his sermon that week. "The earth revolts where the deeds of man go unrepented." Others simply muttered that the ground had stirred again. By year's end, the county board voted once more to designate the area as restricted for use. Officially, the notation cited soil instability and subsurface voids. Unofficially, it was just the same conclusion Marshall Lawson had reached decades earlier, the one that passed through every retelling like a whispered inheritance. The Whitlock farm is best left to itself. And though the years were beginning to bury the legend under the dust of progress, the land refused to grow quiet. Beneath the hum of telegraph wires and the shuffle of trains, a slower rhythm endured, the mechanical pulse of a wheel still turning somewhere under the Oklahoma soil. By 1915, most of Guthrie's old pioneers had either passed on or moved farther west, chasing opportunity in oil towns and railway hubs. The younger generation barely recognized the names that once haunted their parents' fireside talk: Whitlock, Lawson, Alcott. But the prairie, indifferent to memory, held its shape. The grass still grew uneven near the old section line, and at dusk the horizon seemed to dip lower there, as if the land itself exhaled. That spring, a team of geological surveyors from Oklahoma City revisited the area while studying groundwater channels. The Whitlock tract was not on their original plan, but a misread compass led them across it. Their report, filed under anomalous soil conditions, describes a strange reading of subterranean resonance, a metallic vibration inconsistent with geological strata. The lead surveyor, Dr. Morgan Till, suggested it might be remnants of buried machinery from pre-statehood farm operations. Yet, when the crew attempted to locate the source, their instruments failed. Compasses spun, and the phonograph recorders emitted nothing but a low hum. That evening, one of the younger assistants, Robert Deacon, scribbled a note in his pocket journal before departing the site. It read, "Feels alive. Ground ticks like a clock." The note, found years later among his belongings, was the last entry before his sudden resignation from the Geological Bureau. Meanwhile, local accounts continued quietly in taverns and small papers. One ranch hand told of seeing faint silhouettes moving across the ridge at twilight, as if lanterns swung in slow procession. Another man claimed he heard hammering echoing across the fields, steady and deliberate. Not the sound of work, he said, but of someone sealing something shut. That summer, Guthrie experienced an unusual dry spell. The creek near the old Whitlock property shrank to a through, revealing stones long buried beneath the silt. A group of boys collecting arrowheads found an object lodged between them, a corroded metal ring attached to a wooden beam. When they pulled, the beam shifted slightly, and a deep breath of warm air escaped from the gap below. The boys fled, leaving the ring behind. 2 nights later, a farmer reported hearing the windmill again. It started slow, he said, then quickened like it was catching its rhythm. He swore the sound came from the ground, not the air. The Oklahoma Territory reference still lingered in the minds of old residents, even though the territory itself was gone, absorbed into statehood years earlier. But that name, once a symbol of lawless expansion, had become something else, a shorthand for untamed land, a reminder that not all soil had been settled. In the winter of that same year, a violent storm rolled across Logan County. Lightning struck repeatedly near Guthrie Creek, igniting dry grass and revealing, for one brief instant, the ghostly silhouette of a turning windmill against the rain, seen by dozens, described by none in the same way. Some said it was a trick of light. Others whispered it was the past rising to greet the storm. When dawn came, the land looked the same as ever, bare, wind-scoured, empty. But those who lived nearby claimed the air carried a new stillness, heavier than silence, the kind that comes not when something is gone, but when it's waiting to return. By 1917, almost 30 years had passed since the Whitlocks first arrived on that quiet stretch of prairie. The world beyond Oklahoma had changed beyond recognition. The Great War raged across Europe. Automobiles rattled down once empty roads, and Guthrie's skyline was threaded with telegraph wires and new brick buildings. Yet west of Guthrie Creek, the land that bore their name remained untouched, unclaimed, and unmistakably apart. That spring, a journalist named Albert Crane came from Tulsa to write a feature on Oklahoma's forgotten settlements. He was a rational man, devoted to clear prose and measurable truth. When older townsfolk mentioned the Whitlocks, he smiled politely, assuming it a folktale exaggerated by time. Still, curiosity led him west. Crane's notes from that trip survive in fragments, found years later among his papers. His first entry reads much like a travelogue. Descriptions of the red clay, the empty horizon, the distant sound of cattle. But midway through, his handwriting wavers. Reached the coordinates just before dusk. The air changed, cooler, as though stepping indoors. Grass bent all one direction, though no wind present. Found iron embedded in soil, perhaps remnants of a windmill base. Tapped it. Hollow resonance beneath, sustained for several seconds, felt vibration under soles. Moved away. Crane's article, never printed in full, was summarized by his editor after his return to Tulsa. He came back pale, unwilling to speak of it, the editor wrote. Said only that the prairie was not empty after all. That same year, a small fire spread through the western grasslands. When it reached the old Whitlock section, locals swore the flames split in two, circling the property before rejoining and moving on. The soil there remained blackened for weeks, the air carrying an odor of metal and rain, even under a clear sky as decades roll. Dion, the legend, became something like a quiet oath among the few who still remembered the old territory days. They would nod toward that barren patch of land and say, "That's where the earth remembers." Some settlers' descendants still refused to build there. Even cattle, when driven too near, skirted the boundary on their own. And every so often, a traveler passing through after nightfall claimed to hear it, a faint mechanical rhythm under the wind, slow and deliberate, echoing from nowhere visible. Modern scholars, revisiting early reports of the Oklahoma Territory, occasionally note the case in footnotes or folklore journals. They treat it as cultural residue, a tale born of isolation, loss, and the psychological weight of a frontier closing in on itself. But those who have stood on that soil know the difference between story and presence. The Whitlock farm no longer appears on maps. The boundaries that once defined it have long faded, and its deeds are dust. Yet in certain seasons, when storms roll low and the prairie hums before the rain, travelers still claim to see something glinting out there, faint and rhythmic, like the slow turn of a blade against a breathless sky. Whether it's memory, machinery, or something older than both, no one can say. But the people of Guthrie know better than to look for its source. For the Whitlocks may have vanished, but the land they claimed has not forgotten them. And somewhere, out on that empty expanse of Oklahoma earth, the windmill still turns.